Chapter 1. The letter with no reflection. It was during one of those damp, mist-laden mornings of late October that I found myself once again seated opposite Sherlock Holmes in our Baker Street lodgings, as the fire gave out a crackling warmth against the London fog that pressed, almost indignantly, against the window panes. My friend sat half-reclined in his armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, the latest edition of the Times discarded at his feet. He had not spoken for the better part of an hour, and I had learned from experience not to mistake his silence for idleness. When Holmes appeared the most languid, his mind was often whirring like a silent machine, its intricate workings hidden behind that cool, detached exterior. "I take it," he said at length, without turning his head toward me, "that you've not yet noticed the letter, which arrived precisely 43 minutes ago, and now rests atop the coal scuttle." Startled, I set down the journal I had been thumbing and followed his gaze. Sure enough, there sat a pale envelope of fine vellum, its seal bearing the impression of an ornate rose pressed in crimson wax. "I confess I hadn't," I admitted, standing to retrieve it. "But how on earth—" "Not how, Watson," he replied, rising swiftly, "but rather why. Why would someone leave a letter so deliberately out of place, away from the table or the mantel, where one might naturally expect correspondence to rest? And more curiously still," he reached for a small silver mirror from the shelf. "Observe." He held the mirror behind the letter. To my astonishment, the reflection showed the scuttle and the rug and even the edge of the envelope, but not the seal. "Good heavens," I murmured. "Precisely," Holmes said, his eyes narrowing with rare interest. "We have just encountered an epistolary phantom." I turned the envelope in my hands. The paper was faintly scented with lavender and bore no return address. Only 2 words graced the front in a feminine, slanted hand: Sherlock Holmes. With no small sense of apprehension, I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet, folded once, and written upon it in that same delicate hand: "The mirror in the east drawing-room does not reflect my brother. He stands before it and disappears. If you value truth over reason, come to Windmere Hall at once. We are not safe, V." I read it aloud to Holmes, who had already donned his coat and was reaching for his violin case, which he often used for travel when concealing sensitive items. "Windmere Hall," I repeated. "That's in Sussex, is it not? Near Bexhill?" "Indeed." He nodded. "An old estate known more for its hothouses than for haunting mirrors. Yet the phrase 'truth over reason' is most singular, Watson. And this," he tapped the letter gently, "this is no trivial hoax. I suspect the writer knows far more than she reveals. Do you think the brother is in danger?" "I think," he said, pausing at the threshold, "that a mirror that lies is more dangerous than a truth one ignores." We departed Baker Street within the hour, Holmes unusually silent for most of the train journey. He spent it gazing out the fogged window, the letter clasped in his gloved fingers, as though he were trying to draw meaning from the pressure of the ink itself. It was past dusk when we arrived at the gates of Windmere Hall, a brooding mansion, set against the dark shoulder of a forested hill. The gravel drive was slick with recent rain, and a low mist clung to the surrounding hedgerows, like spectral hands refusing to let go. A footman met us at the door, his face pale and voice hushed. "Miss Violetta awaits you in the library, sir." "Miss Violetta?" Holmes asked, with a flick of his eyebrow. Then she is not the mistress of the house? No, sir, the footman replied, avoiding Holmes' gaze. She is the sister of Master Edwin. The family has seen much distress of late. Holmes said nothing, but I could feel the tension coil within him as we were led through high-ceilinged corridors lined with ancestral portraits. More than once I thought I glimpsed movement from the corners of my eye, perhaps tricks of the candlelight, but the unease was tangible, and I could sense Holmes registering every subtle creak of floorboard, every silence too long held miss. Violetta was standing by the hearth when we entered the library. She was tall and thin, her face pale yet striking, with hair of a deep auburn hue pulled back severely from her face. Her eyes, green, steady, and rimmed with shadows, met Holmes with what I can only describe as desperate composure. Mr. Holmes, she said softly, thank you for coming. I feared I would be too late. Holmes inclined his head, but said nothing. You received my letter? Indeed. A curious note, Holmes replied. More so for the peculiar effect of its seal in a mirror. Tell me, Miss Violetta, did you intend it to vanish in reflection? She hesitated. No, I did not. I used the wax my brother keeps in his study. I thought nothing of it. That study, Holmes murmured, half to himself. And your brother? He is here? She looked away. He was, but he has not come down from the east drawing room since yesterday morning. The servants are afraid to enter. They whisper. I B-O-U-T something in the mirror. I exchanged a glance with Holmes. And you, Miss Violetta? He asked. Do you believe the mirror lies? I do not know what I believe anymore, she whispered, but I stood there with him. I saw it with my own eyes. He stood directly before it, and his reflection vanished. A silence followed this declaration. Holmes moved closer. You are not a woman easily given to fantasy, I suspect. No, sir. Then you will allow me to investigate the room tonight. Her eyes widened. Tonight? There is no time to waste, he replied. Whatever trickery or truth is at work, it requires darkness to thrive. And I wish to meet it on its own terms. It was nearly midnight when Holmes, lantern in hand, entered the east drawing room. I followed close behind, though a distinct chill had begun to permeate the very air, as though the room were buried beneath some invisible. The mirror was a tall, gilded thing, standing nearly to the ceiling in an elaborate rococo frame. Holmes approached it slowly, his eyes darting to every edge of the glass, noting angles, shadows, and, presumably, the direction of the moonlight which filtered weakly through the half-drawn drape's dot. He motioned for me to stand before it. I obeyed. There, he said, you're clearly visible. Now step back. To the left. Stop. He narrowed his eyes. Now again, but to the right. Excellent. I saw myself reflected clearly with each movement until Holmes took my place. And then, for one instant, I could not see him. He stood where I had stood, and the mirror remained blank, showing only the empty room behind him. I gasped. Holmes stepped forward. His reflection reappeared. I had suspected as much, he said calmly, but with an undercurrent of tension. This mirror has been treated or altered. But why? For whom? And then came the voice, faint, like a whisper drawn through a slit. Of old wood, Sherlock Holmes. We turned, but there was no one there, not only the mirror, and the reflection now visible was not ours. Chapter 2. A voice from beyond the glass. For a long moment, Holmes and I stood frozen in the stillness of the east drawing room, our eyes riveted on the tall, gilded mirror whose reflection no longer showed us, but rather a scene that did not match the room around us. In the looking-glass, the room remained. In place, same drapes, same fireplace, but something was off. The wallpaper shimmered subtly with a different pattern, and the fire that burned in the hearth within the mirror's world was colder in hue, bluish rather than orange gold. The figure before it, though vague in outline, stood unmistakably still, and tall, facing away from us. "Do you see it?" I asked in a hushed voice, scarcely able to believe my own eyes. Holmes did not answer at once. His head inclined slightly, as though studying the illusion with the same concentration he might apply to a torn scrap of evidence or a smudge upon a cuff. "I see it," he said quietly, "but the question is not what we see. The question is why it wants to be seen." The mirror's surface shimmered slightly, like light seen through water. The tall figure remained turned away, unmoving. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the image faded, and once again we saw only our own reflections cast back at us in the expected symmetry. Holmes stepped away and turned toward the door. "Watson, I believe we must speak further with Miss Violeta, and I must examine the study at once, the brothers' sanctuary, where that wax was stored. There is something in this house that resists visibility, which makes it all the more important we learn how to see it." As we exited the drawing room, I cast one final glance over my shoulder. The mirror stood solemnly in its alcove, cold and silent. Giving nothing away, we found Miss Violeta in the same library where we'd first encountered her. She was seated now, clasping a porcelain teacup between her fingers, though she made no attempt to drink. The fire had burned low, and her face was lit from beneath, casting her eyes into deep shadow. When she saw Holmes, she set the cup down with a slight tremor. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Holmes inclined his head. "We saw ... something. A figure within the mirror that had no business being there. A distortion of reality that has been crafted or perhaps invited." "Tell me, Miss Violeta, was the mirror recently acquired?" "No," she said. "It has been in the family for generations. But my brother Edwin had it moved into the drawing room just a fortnight ago." "Why?" "He claimed the original one in old Venetian glass had cracked inexplicably. The servants said they heard a sound like thunder from the room and found the mirror in shards. Edwin replaced it with this one, taken from an unused chamber in the attic. He seemed ... fixated on it." Holmes seated himself beside her. "Fixated how?" "He would sit before it at night. He stopped going out, stopped eating at table. I would find him standing there for hours, staring. Once I asked him what he saw. He said, 'The truth that the world hides.'" Holmes tapped his fingers together. "Did he ever speak of voices?" "Of whispers?" Violeta hesitated. "Yes. The night before he vanished, I heard him murmuring to someone. But when I looked in, he was alone. And since then, no one has entered the room," she said. "Not until you." "Who lived in the house before your brother took over?" Holmes asked abruptly. "Any deaths in recent history, family quarrels, tragedies?" She looked surprised by the line of questioning, but answered readily enough. "Our father, Lord Richard Tunstall, Passed away 3 years ago. His heart, they said. He died in that very drawing room, though at the time the mirror had not been moved in. Before that, my Uncle Gregory vanished under strange circumstances. He had become reclusive, and then one night simply disappeared. But no body was ever found. Holmes stood. I will require access to Lord Tunstall's papers, Edwin's study, and that attic room from whence the mirror came. And Watson, would you kindly examine any surviving family portraits? I suspect we may find more truth painted in oil than polished in glass. The study of Edwin Tunstall was as one might expect of a Victorian gentleman of scientific inclination, neat, precise, and oppressively orderly. Books on optics, psychology, and esoteric philosophies filled the shelves. Holmes scanned the spines like a man reading ciphers, plucking out a volume here and there to inspect marginalia or dog-eared pages. On the desk, beside an extinguished lamp, sat a small tin of crimson sealing, wax identical to the wax on the envelope we had received. Holmes unscrewed the tin and sniffed it, then scraped a sample onto a blotter. "Unusual resin," he murmured. "Not entirely wax. There's a trace of myrrh and mercury. That is no ordinary formula." He continued his search, and within moments uncovered a leather-bound journal, hidden beneath a false bottom drawer. Holmes pried it out gently and handed it to me. "Watson, your reading voice, if you please." I opened to the most recent entries. October 12th. The mirror stirs. When I stand before it at twilight, I feel a sensation like a breath across the skin, though no wind stirs. Violetta says I've grown pale. Perhaps I am nearing something, some veil that is thinning. October 14th. I saw Gregory, not in the flesh, but within the mirror. He stood behind me, unmoving. When I turned, no one was there. He did not age. How could he not age? October 16th. I heard the voice again. It told me to step through. I know not what it means, but I believe the mirror is not just a reflection. It is a gate, or a prison, one not made of stone. I closed the book with a soft thud. Holmes' expression darkened. "So it's come to that," he said. "A man of science drawn into the abyss by belief guided, I suspect, by manipulation. Something within. That mirror has been constructed or summoned to fracture perception. The trick is not supernatural, Watson. It's psychological. Something or someone is weaponizing the mind against its own certainty." I frowned. "You still believe it a trick?" "I believe even madness obeys certain rules," he said. Our search led us next to the attic. It was a place of dust and disuse, filled with moth-eaten curtains, old trunks, and the skeletal remains of forgotten furniture. The mirror's original place was easy to identify by the clear patch on the wall where dust had not settled. Nearby stood a small chest, half open, containing what appeared to be a collection of odd glass instruments, lenses, prisms, and antique mirrors etched with runes. I did not recognize Holmes examined them with interest. "This," he said, holding up a small oval mirror bordered in black wood, "is a scrying glass, used in rituals for divination. And this prism here, it's been treated with silver nitrate. Whoever assembled this collection was not merely hoarding trinkets. They were experimenting." He turned slowly, gazing about the attic, and I began to suspect Gregory Tunstall's disappearance was no ordinary vanishing. He may have believed he could cross into the reflection, or trap something that came through it. But surely, I said, a mirror is only glass. It cannot. Holmes raised a finger. Glass, yes. But perception? That's far more fragile. He stooped to pick up a folded parchment wedged between a drawer and the floorboards. It was a sketch, a diagram, showing angles of reflection, a curved mirror, and a human eye. Beneath it was scribbled, "Perception shifts when the geometry of light no longer conforms. The mind fills in what the eye omits." But what if the omission is deliberate? Holmes stood slowly. "We are not dealing merely with fear, Watson. We are dealing with manipulation. I would wager someone has altered that mirror, its curvature, its backing, perhaps even its position relative to light, all to produce an effect on the viewer, subtle, disorienting, cumulative. And the voices? That," Holmes said gravely, "may be the most dangerous illusion of all." That evening we gathered once again in the drawing room. Holmes instructed the servants to extinguish every source of light except one oil lamp. He adjusted the angle of its flame toward the mirror, shifting the shadows along the edge of the glass dot. Miss Violetta stood beside me, her hands trembling. Holmes stepped forward, positioned himself in the exact spot where the reflection had vanished before, and looked directly into the mirror. For a long while he said nothing. Then he reached out slowly and placed his hand on the surface of the mirror. The glass shivered, and then from within it came a whisper, not a ghostly moan, but a cold, clinical voice. "Sherlock Holmes, welcome." Chapter 3. The whisper that knew his name. The moment the voice echoed from within the glass, a tremor passed through the room. It was not merely a sound, but a sensation, a ripple in the air that seemed to pass through skin and bone. The voice was cold, level, and unmistakably real. It had spoken Holmes' name with a chilling familiarity, as though it had waited for him. Beside me, Miss Violetta inhaled sharply. I turned instinctively, expecting Holmes to draw back, to show some visible reaction, but he remained absolutely still, his hand resting lightly upon the mirror's surface, his gaze fixed into the depths of the reflection. "Holmes," I whispered, uncertain whether to interrupt whatever hold the mirror had upon him. His fingers twitched. "Sherlock Holmes," the voice said again, slightly louder, now tinged with a tone of wry amusement. "You do not frighten easily. Good." At that, Holmes blinked and withdrew his hand. "The mirror," he said calmly, "contains no ghost, no demon. But it does contain someone or something capable of observation and speech." He stepped back and motioned for me to bring the lantern closer. I did so, adjusting the flame until the light danced directly across the glass. "What are you?" Holmes asked aloud. The mirror remained still. Holmes continued, speaking not with fear, but with the cool detachment of a man addressing a riddle. "You know my name. You spoke it twice. That means you recognize me, perhaps from observation, or from information fed into some concealed apparatus. You are not supernatural, but you are ... theatrical." He turned abruptly to Miss Violetta. "Are there any passageways? Behind this wall? Hidden corridors, servant tunnels, anything that might grant access to the back of this mirror?" She shook her head. "Not that I know of. That wall backs onto the music room, but there's nothing between." "Then I must inspect the rear immediately." Holmes turned on his heel, sweeping out of the drawing room with purpose. I followed, leaving Miss Violetta visibly shaken, but silent. the mirror now returning only our own reflections. As though it had never spoken at all, we entered the music room, an echoing chamber with a grand pianoforte, covered in dust, and a harp that had not been tuned in years. Holmes crossed swiftly to the far wall and pressed his palm against the paneling. "Here," he murmured, "this section. Do you feel it?" "Hollow." I knocked with my knuckles. The sound echoed strangely. Distant. Holmes drew a thin blade from his walking stick and wedged it into a seam in the wainscoting. With a deft motion, he pried open a narrow panel. Behind it lay a narrow space, just large enough for a man to crawl through bare wooden beams, cobwebs, and the faint scent of something acrid. "A crawl space," I murmured. "Indeed, and likely." "Old as the house itself," Holmes said. "Judging by the dust, it has not been used in years until recently." He stepped inside, stooping low, and I followed. The tunnel bent sharply to the left, then rose slightly, finally terminating behind the east drawing-room's mirror. There, in the gloom, Holmes struck a match and revealed a small wooden ledge and a mechanism of wires, pulleys, and a series of thin slats angled like the shutters of a blind affixed behind the glass. "Well," he said softly, "what have we here?" He examined the device, brushing dust away with the sleeve of his coat. Affixed to the wall beside the mirror was a narrow speaker, horn discreet and well-worn, and beside it a peculiar metallic cylinder, not unlike an old phonograph drum humming ever so slightly. Holmes tapped it. "It's been modified, powered by clockwork, most likely. A playback mechanism, but one that responds to voice or proximity." As if in answer, a faint click sounded, and the voice from the mirror returned. "Sherlock Holmes, I see you now." But this time it came from the device behind the mirror, not from the room. Holmes nodded. A pre-recorded message, timed or triggered by presence. "Very clever." I frowned. "But how does it know your name?" Holmes turned the cylinder gently and revealed a wax coil etched with needle marks, dozens of them, like the grooves of a record. Some were labeled. One read, Gregory, another, Violetta, and another, Holmes. "Whoever created this," Holmes said grimly, "recorded individual messages for each person. This was no prank. This was a performance meant to disturb, to deceive, a calculated form of psychological manipulation." "But by whom?" I asked. Holmes narrowed his eyes. "I suspect we are circling ever closer to Gregory Tunstall, the vanished uncle." We returned to the study, where Holmes laid out the evidence on the desk like an autopsy. The wax, the journal, the phonograph drum, and the sketch from the attic all pointed to a single orchestrator, Gregory Tunstall, a man lost to obsession, perhaps driven to test the limits of perception and belief. "Consider this," Holmes sighed, pacing. "Gregory believes a mirror can show more than the visible world. He isolates himself, constructs devices behind the glass, and begins engineering hallucinations. His nephew Edwin finds the mirror and begins to unravel, in turn falling into the same delusion, the same abyss." I nodded, and the messages recorded, to simulate voices, to lure them further. "Precisely. Edwin's behavior matches that of a man under persistent psychological suggestion. The mirror becomes a symbol of revelation, a window to supposed truths. But in truth, it's just a stage." I frowned. "Then you believe Gregory is still alive?" "That," Holmes said, "remains to be seen. Later that night, as the house lay still, and even the wind seemed to pause, Holmes made an unusual request. "Watson," he said, standing before the mirror once more, "I want you to leave me alone in this room for the next hour. Are you certain that's wise? Perhaps not, but I must provoke the trap. If Gregory still resides within this house, either bodily or through his mechanisms, he will not ignore a direct challenge." I reluctantly agreed, though I hated leaving him in that cursed room. When I returned precisely 60 minutes later, Holmes was standing in the dark. The lamp burned low, his eyes heavy-lidded but focused. He turned to me and said one thing only. "I heard a live voice this time, Watson." The next morning, Holmes instructed the staff to search the basement storerooms, particularly those sealed or unused. At first, nothing emerged. But then one of the older maids, a nervous woman named Agnes, mentioned that an old wine cellar, long abandoned, had been locked for years. Holmes demanded it be opened at once. What we found within chilled me to the bone. The cellar had been transformed, not into a lair, but a workshop. Glass instruments, metal coils, diagrams of human eyes, and mirror refractions covered the walls. In the center stood a tall, cracked mirror twin to the one upstairs, and in the far corner, a cot, long unoccupied. Beside it, a crumpled, blood-stained coat. Gregory was here, Holmes said softly, but no longer. Back in the drawing room, Holmes inspected the ornate mirror one final time. With gloved fingers, he loosened the slats behind the glass, adjusted the light, and turned the speaker cone sideways, disabling its effect. The illusion was broken, and as if released from its spell, the air in the room felt lighter. No more whispers, no more strange reflections. Just glass and its ordinary lies. But Holmes, as always, was unsatisfied. "There's more yet," he said. "Someone set the stage, but who pulled the final curtain? And where is Edwin?" At that moment, a scream echoed from the west corridor. We ran at once, Holmes ahead of me, long coat trailing behind him. We found Miss Violetta at the foot of the staircase, trembling, pointing toward the door at the end of the hall. "He's here," she gasped. "Edwin, he's returned." Holmes pushed open the door, and there, seated calmly at the writing desk in the library, was Edwin Tunstall, alive, pale, and very much himself. "I've been watching," he said slowly, his voice strangely flat. "I had to see how far it would go." Holmes stepped forward. "What do you mean?" Edwin raised his eyes, and for the first time, I noticed the faint shimmer of light in his pupils like glass catching a flame. "It's not the mirror that lies, Mr. Holmes," he whispered. "It's the world around it that refuses to tell the truth." Chapter 4. A mind unfolding the library had never felt more silent, nor its air more laden with unspoken things. Edwin Tunstall sat at the desk like a man risen from the grave, not frail or fevered as one might expect after a disappearance, but composed, calm, almost unsettlingly so. A tremor rippled through Miss Violetta as she stepped forward, her voice breaking like fragile porcelain. "Edwin ... Where have you been?" He did not look at her at first. Instead, his gaze was fixed on Holmes, as though he recognized him in some profound, disturbing way. In the reflection, Edwin said slowly, as if testing the weight of each word, "Not trapped, not lost, but observing, understanding." Holmes stepped forward cautiously, motioning for Violetta to remain back. The detective's sharp gaze did not waver. "And what did you observe, Mr. Tunstall?" he asked. Edwin smiled faintly, though it was the sort of smile that lacked any warmth, like the flicker of moonlight on a blade. "I saw things for what they were. The mirror doesn't lie, Mr. Holmes. It reveals. But not all are ready to see." "You vanished for 3 days," Holmes said evenly, "during which your sister feared for your life, and the servants whispered of hauntings. You've created or inherited a house of illusions. Speak plainly, sir. Where have you been?" Edwin finally turned to Violetta. "There's a room beneath the house," he said. "You know it, don't you, sister?" She paled. "The oubliette?" Holmes' brow twitched. "An oubliette? You possess a medieval dungeon beneath your home?" "It's not a dungeon," Edwin said, "but a chamber sealed from outside light. Gregory used it once for his meditations. For his trials, I found his journals. And when I stood before the mirror, I realized I was seeing something only half complete. So I followed his path and entered the oubliette." I asked. "I was there." Edwin nodded. "For 2 nights. No food, no light, just the mirror. I brought it down myself." Holmes gave him a long, steady look. "And what did you hope to learn?" Edwin's fingers twitched. "What is real?" After seeing Edwin safely to his chamber and ensuring Violetta would remain with him, Holmes and I returned to the drawing room, where the great mirror still loomed. Though Holmes had disabled its mechanisms, it seemed still to watch us in its own silent way. He stood before it, arms crossed, brow furrowed deeper than I had seen in many weeks. "There is a sickness in this house, Watson," he murmured. "But it is not born of ghosts or phantoms. It is born of a man's determination to unmake the limits of the mind." "Do you believe Edwin has gone mad?" "I believe Edwin is under the influence of a design that did not begin with him. Consider the facts. Gregory disappears, Edwin follows. Both obsess over this mirror. But the pattern is larger still. This is not merely an inheritance of property, Watson. It is an inheritance of obsession." Holmes turned away from the glass. "Tomorrow," he said, "we go deeper. I want access to Gregory's last known letters, anything sealed in the family vaults, and full access to the oubliette." By noon the next day, Violetta, still visibly shaken, provided us with a bundle of her uncle's letters, most written, in a tight, rigid hand on expensive stationery. Several were addressed not to friends or family, but to obscure names members of societies I had never heard of. The Society for Perceptual Disruption, the Circle of the Convex Eye, and one chillingly marked, "To the Curator of the Reflected Temple." "This is occultism," I murmured. "No," Holmes said, scanning one letter. "It's pseudo-scientific obsession masked in mystical language. Gregory believed the mirror could be altered to expose fundamental distortions in reality. Here this letter references something he calls the convergence angle." He handed it to me. The letter read, "Once the observer aligns perfectly to the convergence angle between light, perception, and subconscious expectation, the mirror ceases to reflect and begins to speak. That is when the truth begins. All else is lie." "Delirium," I said, "or deliberate suggestion," Holmes corrected. Gregory understood that the human mind fills gaps in perception. He created a system to induce those gaps, to cause others to experience what he designed them to experience. He turned to me sharply. "Watson, Gregory was not mad. He was a puppeteer. And Edwin? One of his marionettes. We descended into the oubliette just before dusk dot. It was a chamber of old stone, damp and claustrophobic, carved deep beneath the manor's wine cellars. Violetta had not entered it since childhood, when Gregory would lock himself inside for research. She had assumed the room was empty until Edwin rediscovered it. Now. As Holmes held the lantern aloft, I saw the truth. The walls were lined with fragments of broken mirrors, etched glass, symbols, triangles within circles, looping spirals, strange alphabets scrawled in soot or etched in chalk, and at the center stood a pedestal. Upon it sat a small circular mirror, darkened by soot. Holmes approached it and cleared the surface with a handkerchief. "No reflection," he said quietly, "because it has no silver backing. It's glass, only a decoy." He tapped its base and found a hollow compartment beneath. Within it were pages, fragile, yellowed, bound by twine. Gregory's final manuscript. Holmes opened it with surgical precision, as though it might dissolve in his hands. He read aloud, "The mirror of lies is not an artifact. It is a doorway of suggestion. I cannot pass through, but I can lead others to believe they have. Once they do, I control what they perceive. My words will guide them. My reflections will distort them. My silence will terrify them. They will believe the mirror knows them. It does not. I do. Sherlock Holmes will one day read these words, and when he does, I will already have made him doubt his own perception." Holmes paused. "That was written years ago," I whispered. Holmes stared at the page for a long moment. Then he slowly closed the manuscript. "We're not dealing with a mirror that lied, Watson," he said at last. "We are dealing with a man who made everyone else lie to themselves." Gregory was a master of psychological engineering more dangerous than any conjurer. We returned to Edwin's room just past 8 o'clock. The fire had burned low, and he sat upright in the armchair, staring once again into a smaller hand. "Mirror. Holmes entered without knocking. Double quotes. Mr. Tunstall," he said coolly, "I believe your uncle never died. I believe he created this mirror to perpetuate himself, not in body, but in idea." Edwin did not look away. "He was always clever," he replied, "but he was not alone in his visions. Others believed." "You are not possessed," Holmes said. "You are conditioned." Edwin finally turned toward him. "Conditioned. Or liberated. I see what you refuse to see, Mr. Holmes. The mirror isn't the lie. It's the only surface that doesn't flatter. The rest of the world hides its fractures. And if I told you that your mirror has no power without your belief," Holmes countered, "that you were seeing what your uncle taught you to see?" Edwin hesitated, and then something shifted in his face, just a flicker. Doubt. Holmes pressed forward. "Gregory was clever, yes, but he never crossed into any hidden dimension. He created systems of manipulation, audio devices, light patterns, isolated environments. You were trapped in a chamber with only his constructs, and you mistook hallucination for revelation." "No," Edwin murmured, but the word lacked strength. "You never vanished," Holmes said firmly. "You hid, and now you're beginning to remember." Edwin's hand trembled. He looked down at the mirror and smashed it on the floor. The spell broke, and Edwin Tunstall collapsed into the armchair, sobbing. Later, in the quiet of the upstairs hall, Holmes stood beside me with arms crossed. "It's over," he said. "The mirror will be removed, the attic sealed. Edwin will recover, though it may take time. And as for Gregory ... He looked out the window at the wind-blown trees beyond ... double quotes ... and genius died the moment it fed upon others. I placed a hand on his shoulder. "There was a moment," I said, softly, "when you doubted your own perception, wasn't there?" He did not speak for a time. Then he said, briefly, "And that's the danger of a lie dressed in truth. Even the sharpest mind can feel its edge." Chapter 5. Refractions of a mastermind. The morning after Edwin's collapse dawned gray and still, with a windless hush hanging over Tunstall House. The staff moved about in subdued silence, avoiding the east wing entirely, as though the drawing room and its infamous mirror still breathed with unnatural life. Violetta remained close to her brother's side, soothing him with soft, measured words and warm tea, though Edwin himself barely spoke. Holmes and I, after a sparse breakfast and a stiff pot of black Darjeeling, retired to the library. There, Holmes sat deep in a worn wing-back chair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. It was not his usual state of alert calculation. It was the quiet of a mind retracing every thread of a tapestry he had not yet entirely unraveled. "What troubles you?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. Holmes blinked slowly. "The simplicity of it, Watson." "Simplicity?" He rose abruptly and began pacing. Gregory's trap was clever, no doubt. The mirror, the crawl space, the mechanisms he knew. How to produce disorientation. And Edwin, vulnerable, isolated, idealistic, became the perfect subject. But even so, it's all too perfect. Too theatrical, too clean. I frowned. "You believe there is more?" "I do," Holmes said, stopping at the hearth, "because Gregory's letters suggest he feared interference. He didn't write like a man consumed by solitary madness. He wrote like a man under observation." "By whom?" "That," Holmes murmured, "is what I intend to find out." After instructing the housekeeper to secure both the attic and the oubliette, Holmes asked Violetta for one final favor: access to Gregory's private correspondence with external parties, specifically his dealings with scientific, philosophical, or otherwise esoteric societies. Violetta nodded and, after a brief absence, returned with a thick, dust-caked folio bound in red leather. The gold initials GT were embossed on its spine. "I never read through it," she said, setting it gently on the table. "My father once forbade me to touch it. After Gregory vanished, it simply sat untouched." Holmes opened it with care. Inside were scores of letters, many marked with peculiar symbols. A compass rose with an unblinking eye at its center, or a mirror flanked by inverted torches. Several were written in cipher. Others came from places as distant as Trieste, Vienna, and Alexandria. He pulled one free and unfolded it. "Dear brother, in reflection, we await your final calculations regarding the threshold ratio. The device functions, but we lack stability. The minds of the observers fracture too quickly. You suggested a method of anchoring perception via familiar names, such as the Great Consulting Detective. Intriguing. Let us know when your prototype is complete. Acolyte J." Covent Square, London. Holmes looked up, his face unreadable. He had collaborators? perhaps an entire circle. A cult? I asked. Holmes frowned. Not a cult in the traditional sense. More likely a secretive research collective, unorthodox, perhaps unethical, but scientific in ambition. Gregory may have been a leading figure among them. He tapped the letter. They used my name as a psychological anchor, a test, a trigger. I stiffened. So that voice, it was meant for you. Yes, Holmes said. A form of targeting. They calculated that the illusion would carry more weight if it addressed me directly. This was not a haunting, Watson. It was a demonstration. Later that afternoon, we made our way back to the attic, this time with a clear goal: to find any document, diagram, or artifact referencing the threshold ratio. The air was dry and musty, the sun filtering weakly through a stained glass window, half obscured by dust. As we sifted through the boxes, Holmes grew increasingly focused, searching, like a man hunting a cipher within a page. He stopped suddenly and pulled a leather scroll from beneath a false-bottomed crate. Unrolling it, we saw a detailed diagram of the mirror apparatus, complete with annotations in Latin and Greek, measurements in fractions of inches, and at the top, a title written in ornate calligraphy: Speculum Disruptum, the Threshold. Engined beneath the title were three principles. Reflection is perception. Perception is belief. Belief can be built. Holmes pointed to a notation at the bottom of the diagram. Activate only in the presence of a subject of certainty. Recommended, Holmes. S. Consulting Detective, London. He exhaled sharply. They were testing more than the mind's limits, Watson. They were testing mine. That evening, Holmes sent a telegram to Inspector Lestrade, requesting surveillance on one Acolyte J. In Covent Square, within hours, a reply came. Jasper Griggs, recently expelled from the Royal College of Physicians for methods incompatible with medical science, had occupied a property there under various aliases. The premises had since been vacated, but neighbors reported odd lights, midnight visitors, and the unmistakable smell of burning resin. Resin, Holmes muttered. Like the wax, he folded the telegram. This mystery is no longer confined to this house, Watson. It extends far beyond into a network of minds determined to rewrite reality itself. That night, as Holmes sat once more before the now muted mirror, I joined him silently. He had placed a simple chair before it, not out of curiosity, I think, but out of confrontation. Have you ever considered, Watson, he said softly, that a lie told often enough becomes indistinguishable from truth? That perhaps even we could be made to question our most rational beliefs? I shook my head. You've built your entire life on reason, he nodded. True, but reason is not immune to erosion. That was Gregory's brilliance. He didn't try to break the mind. He merely placed a grain of doubt and let it grow. I turned toward the mirror. Its surface now reflected only what was truly there: a detective, a doctor, and the deep shadows of a house that had forgotten peace. But Holmes, I said, if Gregory is dead, who maintains this illusion now? Holmes was silent for a long time. Then he said, I do not believe Gregory is dead. And at that precise moment, a knock came at the front door. Mrs. Whittaker, the housekeeper, opened it and screamed. We rushed down the hall, and there, silhouetted in the doorway, stood a man cloaked in black, his face thin and lined, his gray hair wild and unkempt. You stepped into the light. "Gregory Tunstall," Holmes said flatly. The man inclined his head. "You've come," he said softly. "At last." Chapter 6. The confrontation of reflections. The late afternoon sun, pale and wan, filtered through the tall windows of Windermere Hall's entrance hall, striking one last shaft of light on the figure standing before us. Gregory Tunstall tall, silvering at the temples, eyes bright with manic clarity, surveyed the assembled company as though he were a conductor addressing his orchestra. Holmes stepped forward, gloved hands clasped behind his back, his posture calm yet unyielding. At his side I felt the steady thrum of anticipation. This would be no ordinary meeting of long-lost relatives, but the pivotal moment we had awaited, one that might untangle or tighten the threads of the entire mystery. "Mr. Tunstall," Holmes began, voice steady yet carrying an underlying edge, "you have returned to your ancestral home after being presumed dead for years. Pray explain how you have managed such a feat." Gregory inclined his head, a half-smile playing on his lips. "Mr. Holmes, the question is not how I returned, but why I ever left." He paused, his gaze sweeping first over Violetta, pale, and poised beside her still recovering brother, then across Holmes and me. "You see a prisoner emerging from darkness. I see a mind ready for illumination." Holmes did not flinch. "You speak in metaphors. We seek facts. Your nephew has suffered under your illumination. You manipulated him, pushed him toward delusion, perhaps even danger. Why?" Gregory's eyes glittered. "Manipulated? No. Dear Holmes, I guided. Edwin was destined for great discovery, but he lacked direction until I provided it. You see, the mirror is not the villain. It is the medium, and every medium needs a maestro." He stepped closer, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I taught him to see beyond the veil. I taught him to hear what others dismiss. Is that a crime?" Holmes glared. "When your pupil teeters on the brink of madness, when he vanishes into some self-constructed abyss, you leave him there? You abandon family? That is no teaching, it is cruelty." Gregory shrugged elegantly. "You exaggerate. He tested my theories well, and then I released him to recover, to integrate revelation into his mortal existence. A proper apprenticeship requires trials. I could not suppress a shudder. Trials that involved mechanical trickery, witness-recorded voices, clandestine crawl spaces, and 3 days of isolation in a pitch-black oubliette. That might be called torture by many." "Ah," Gregory sighed. "But without trial there is no transformation. You, Mr. Holmes, have never needed to test your own edifice of logic, have you? You rely on perception and deduction that you take for granted. Yet when confronted by people who can shape perception like me, you falter." Holmes's jaw tightened. "I falter only when my perceptions are tampered with. You exploited human psychology, your own nephew's mind, as though it were some laboratory specimen. And Violetta here," he gestured to Edwin's sister, "do you deny causing her torment?" Gregory's expression softened as he looked at Violetta. "My dear sister endured much, but it was her love for Edwin that drove her to seek help. Her discomfort pales beside the expansion of consciousness she might yet experience." Violetta's lips quivered. "You speak as though I were some instrument. Edwin nearly died. Your experiment almost killed him." He lifted a hand as though to silence her, yet his gaze remained tender. He tested himself willingly, Violetta, and he emerged changed. His tone turned to Holmes. "And you, Mr. Holmes, what have you tested lately? You face the impossible, everyday crime beyond reason, deceit beyond words. Yet you remain imprisoned in your homuncular view of the world. I invite you to break your chains." Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, as though shifting from parley to prosecution, he leveled a steely gaze at Gregory's face. "Your theories, your experiments were based on exploiting fear, isolation, and suggestion. That is less a path to enlightenment than a path to cruelty. You weaponized your own family." Gregory smiled again, but it was brittle. "You mistake cruelty for purpose, Holmes. But I understand your revulsion. It is animal instinctive, fear of the unknown. Nevertheless, I have work to complete." Holmes's eyes sparkled with determination. "Indeed you do, and I intend to finish it for you. Inspector Lestrade arrives this evening, along with warrants for your arrest charges of endangerment, unlawful confinement, and psychological abuse. Your instruments will be seized and academic licenses revoked. You'll have ample time to reflect alone on the limits of your experiment." At mention of police, Gregory's smile flickered and died. For the first time, I saw genuine apprehension in his pale eyes. He straightened, brushing a lock of silver hair from his brow. "Ah, the law. Very well. But fear not, I have contingency measures in place. You will witness a final performance, a masterstroke before the curtain falls." Holmes's expression hardened. "Speak plainly, sir, or be silent." Gregory bowed his head slightly, then looked up, eyes flashing. The mirror's purpose was never solely personal. It is a harbinger, an opening. I have correspondents abroad who use the same principles with greater scale. Tonight I will demonstrate the threshold engine's apex, and once witnessed, the implications will be undeniable. Reality is malleable. He paused, then took a small, silver file from his waistcoat pocket. "This," he said softly, "is a compound I designed in aerosol. It heightens suggestibility by affecting neurotransmitters in the olfactory system. A single spray, and viewers become passive participants in the illusion." Holmes moved swiftly, intercepting the file before Gregory could gesture with it. "You would drug us to undermine our will? That is monstrous." Gregory's voice dropped to a whisper. "Monstrous? Or merely innovative? Consider the possibilities. Unified empathy, controlled perception, eradication of prejudice. Or in less altruistic hands, absolute control." Holmes pocketed the vial. "That possibility is too dangerous to allow. Your schemes end tonight." Gregory laughed, a brittle, echoing sound. "Then prepare yourself, Holmes, for you will soon see how far the mirror's influence truly extends." By twilight, the grand drawing room had been transformed. Curtains drawn, candles lit in ornate sconces, and the mirror its glass once. Again, bare stood illuminated under the flickering lamplight. The frame's gilding gleamed dully, and I could sense that the house itself held its breath in anticipation. Lestrade, arriving with a small detachment of officers, took in the scene. With a grim expression, Holmes presented the warrants, and the officers moved quietly to secure the attic, smithereens of the shattered phonograph drum, and any remaining devices. Meanwhile, Gregory reclined in an armchair before the mirror, as though expecting an audience. Violetta hovered near Edwin's side, frail but resolute. I stood beside Holmes, waiting for the moment that Gregory promised would change everything. Lestrade approached Holmes in a low voice. "Sir, shall we place him under arrest now?" Holmes shook his head. "Not until he shows us what he intends. Let us witness the final act, then we shall intervene." Lestrade hesitated but obeyed. The officers held back, arms at ease, but fingers near trigger strings. Gregory motioned for silence. Then, in a clear, resonant voice, he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, friends and skeptics, tonight you will witness the dissolution of doubt. Step forward." Holmes cleared his throat. "Mr. Tunstall, I protest," but Gregory held up a hand, and his tone softened. "Please, no interruptions. I promise this demonstration will require only your attention and perhaps your trust." He stood and pressed a button hidden in the arm of the chair. A subtle hum began from behind the mirror, a hum that resonated through the wooden floorboards like a distant pulse. Then he lifted the silver file and gave it a single deliberate shake. With no warning, he pressed another hidden switch. The button whirred and glowed. A fine mist hissed from a nozzle concealed at the top of the mirror frame, drifting into the room like a phantom fog. I felt it on my skin, cool and unaccountably sweet. I inhaled instinctively, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow. The candlelight elongated, the sound of my own breathing deepened, and I felt my mind open, as though a valve had been turned. I looked at Holmes. His face was pale, his pupils dilated. I realized then that the compound was working. Gregory spoke again, his voice now echoing, as though through a cathedral. "Observe." He stepped to the mirror and placed a hand upon its surface. The glass shimmered, then rippled as though liquid dot in an instant that froze the breath in my lungs. The mirror's surface parted like water, and we saw not our reflections, but a vision of the room transformed. The walls glowed with shifting patterns of light. Candles flickered in impossible colors. Shadows detached themselves and danced in meter. And at the center of this living tableau stood figures, not us, but projections of ourselves, moving as if in some dream. Violetta gasped. Edwin slumped as though on the verge of collapse. Holmes, fighting the haze creeping into his perception, forced himself to step forward. "It's an illusion, light and sound, nothing more." But the vision in the mirror spoke with our voices, yet warped. "We are all reflections. We are the truth you deny." Holmes staggered, but braced himself against the frame. I saw him struggle to maintain focus, his glove brushing away sweat from his brow. "Enough!" Holmes roared. "Lestrade now." At his command, Lestrade and the officers sprang forward, holstering the file and yanking the power cable from behind the mirror. Instantly, the humming ceased. The mist dissipated with a hiss. The rippling glass stilled. Returning to ordinary mirror smoothness, Gregory Tunstall slumped back into his chair, eyes shining with feverish excitement. Holmes stood panting. "Mr. Tunstall," he said flatly, "you have seen how easily the mind can be tricked, but also how easily such trickery can be undone. Your engine may dazzle, but it will never replace truth." Lestrade moved in to cuff Gregory. Violetta rushed forward, tears in her eyes. Edwin, slumping in his chair, looked dazed but a live dot in the sudden stillness of the now silent drawing room. I realized we had passed a threshold ourselves and returned. Shaken but unbowed. Chapter 7. Echoes in the glass the house breathed. Again. It was not a sound nor a tremor, but a sensation, a subtle shift in the air, as though Windmere Hall, long held captive to illusions and shadows, had exhaled after years of silence. Gregory Tunstall had been taken under escort to the carriage waiting beyond the main gate, Lestrade and 2 constables accompanying him. Holmes had refused a moment's rest. Even as I rubbed at my eyes and Violetta led Edwin upstairs to recover, Holmes stood at the hearth of the drawing-room, the dying mirror glinting coldly behind him. The silver frame now seemed ordinary, stripped of menace, its secrets laid bare by Holmes' sharp gaze and stronger will. And yet, as I joined him in the fire's flicker, I knew his mind had not settled. He was not finished. His illusions were precise, I said, offering Holmes a brandy, engineered like traps. But they're broken now. Holmes accepted. Glass, but did not drink. The performance is over, yes, he murmured, but the architecture remains. He turned back to the mirror. A man like Gregory does not act without design. What we witnessed may have been dazzling, even overwhelming, but it was not final. That was not the true objective. You believe there is more? I am certain of it. He raised the brandy to his lips now, but drank only a fraction. Everything Gregory did, every illusion, every psychological device, every ghost story woven through his machinery was not for theatricality alone. It was a test bed, a calibration. For what? I asked. Holmes turned, fixing me with a piercing gaze. For permanence, Watson. The following morning dawned clear and cold. The grounds of Windmere glistened with dew, and the birds had begun, tentatively, to return to the hedgerows. Yet inside the manor, quiet still prevailed. Lestrade had remained in the village, his men guarding the sealed attic and oubliette, while Holmes requested solitude in the study. I found him there amid a flurry of notes, diagrams, and Gregory's confiscated journals. The old grandfather clock ticked solemnly in the corner. He barely looked up. I have been mapping the occurrences, he said without preamble. Not just the ones we witnessed, but all the known anomalies tied to this house since Gregory took residence. He tapped a sheet. There is a pattern. Reflections behaving oddly. Whispers in the walls, vanishing items. Repeated visions of a cloaked figure. I raised an eyebrow. All part of the machinery, surely. Partially, yes, Holmes nodded. But consider this, some reports predate Gregory's installation of the mirror. I have a letter dated 6 years before his arrival from a servant claiming to hear footsteps in the attic at night. Another, 2 decades ago, references a mirror in the hall, reflecting images that did not match reality. I stepped closer. Are you suggesting the phenomena preceded Gregory? No, Holmes said, eyes narrowing. I am suggesting he found something already here and built his work around it. I drew a sharp breath. The mirror? Holmes looked toward the hallway, where the object in question remained draped in canvas, awaiting removal by Lestrade's team. It's not the mirror that matters, it's the position. The mirror is a focusing device. Gregory didn't create the anomaly. He amplified it. He stood suddenly, retrieving Gregory's diagram of the threshold engine. Then, with measured calm, he crossed to the window and aligned it with a chart of the house's architecture. Look, he said, beckoning me closer. The mirror was installed at the intersection of 4 corridors, each perfectly symmetrical. Beneath that location, the oubliette. Above, the attic. He traced the lines with his finger. This house was designed around a central axis one Gregory used with chilling precision, and the mirror was the keystone. Later that afternoon, with Lestrade's permission, Holmes and I descended once more into the oubliette. The stone chamber was cold, damp and silent, as though it had been untouched for centuries. Only the soot-marked walls and faint scent of wax betrayed its recent use. Holmes paced slowly around the perimeter, eyes scanning each crevice, each scroll. His lantern cast long, dancing shadows across symbols I could not begin to understand. He stopped at the center, where the pedestal had once held Gregory's secondary mirror. "This," Holmes said, crouching, "is the true heart of the experiment." He tapped a section of the floor. "Do you hear it?" I listened, and faintly, just beneath the stone, I heard it too, a hollow sound, as if something lay beneath Dot with tools fetched from the estate's ground shed. We pried up the central stones. Beneath was a rusted hatch, sealed with iron bands, and inscribed with a barely visible crest, a stylized eye enclosed. Within 2 concentric circles, Holmes knelt and examined the seal. "This is not Gregory's mark," he said. "It predates him. Perhaps even predates the house." I swallowed. "You think he found this and built upon it?" "Yes. This hatch may have contained something. An object, a chamber, or simply an idea." Gregory believed he had uncovered the source of perception itself, but I believe he only scratched the surface. He turned to me. "We must open it." I hesitated. "And if what lies beneath continues the illusion?" Holmes's gaze darkened. "Then we face it and end it." The hatch opened with a scream of rusted hinges and a waft of air that smelled of earth, iron, and time. Inside, a narrow shaft descended into blackness. We lowered a lantern first, then ourselves, one rung at a time, down into the unknown. Dot at the bottom was a chamber unlike any other we had seen. Not stone, but metal. Not natural, but crafted a dome lined with burnished brass, etched with equations, celestial symbols, and compass roses. Along one wall stood a strange instrument, part telescope, part phonograph, part camera. Dot at the center stood a single shattered mirror. Holmes approached it, breath shallow. "Watson," he said slowly, "this ... This is the prototype." I stepped closer. "Of Gregory's machine?" "No," Holmes said, "of something far older. He rebuilt the upstairs mirror to mimic this, but this was original." He knelt beside the shattered frame. "Look at the backing, silver leaf, but beneath it a second layer. Crystallized lead, designed to reflect only a narrow spectrum of light. What did they hope to see?" I bent over the strange camera. It still held a roll of film. Holmes examined it by lantern light, then sighed. "Damaged, but enough remains." He removed it and tucked it safely in a pouch. "We'll develop this in London. It may show us what Gregory saw or what saw him." We returned to the surface just as night crept into the valley. Lestrade, waiting with constables and a cart, helped us reseal the hatch and secure the remaining evidence. The mirror, now covered and strapped to the cart, would be delivered under guard to Baker Street. Gregory, we later learned, had been placed in a private asylum pending trial. His mind remained lucid but erratic. He spoke of pathways, of shifting thresholds, and of Holmes as both witness and adversary. That night, Holmes stood before the hearth of Windermere Hall one final time. "There is a strange poetry to it," he said softly. "A man so obsessed with truth that he sought to invent it anew?" I nodded. "And yet truth proved stronger." Holmes glanced at the mirror now gone, or merely waiting. He turned to me. "This case, Watson, has left no corpse, no smoking pistol, no locked room mystery in the traditional sense. And yet it may be one of the most dangerous puzzles we have faced." I looked into the darkened window pane beside him, where our reflections hovered, blurred, soft, but undeniably real. "Still see myself," I said. Holmes smiled faintly. "Then we are safe for now." Chapter 8. The image that would not fade. It was a week after our return to Baker Street when the photograph first emerged. Holmes, having personally overseen the transfer of the fractured mirror and related instruments to a secured room in our flat, had arranged for the film recovered from the underground chamber to be developed by a trusted contact, one Mr. Emil Gardner, a chemist and amateur lensman with an interest in experimental emulsions. I was present when the envelope arrived. Thick with tension and brittle with secrets. It lay unopened on the table for nearly half an hour as Holmes smoked 2 full pipes and paced the Persian rug until it ruffled at the corners. Finally, in one swift movement, he sliced the seal with his pocket knife and pulled out the stiff sheets. There were 3 images. Each bore the grain and ghostliness of a thinness, of a coarseness, of a pup knife, and pulled out the stiff sheets. There were 3 images. Each bore the grain and ghostliness of a costliness, of a cut knife, photograph taken in near total darkness. But even through the mottled blacks and grays, it was evident these were not mere architectural studies. They were glimpses into something else. The first showed the chamber as we had seen it, circular, metal-walled, lined with strange instruments. But in the photograph the instruments glowed faintly, as if touched by light, not of the visible spectrum. The shattered mirror centered in the frame reflected nothing at all, not even the chamber. The second image was darker, more abstract. A faint humanoid silhouette, elongated, blurred, without visible features, hovered near the mirror. Its outline wavered like heat on summer stones. Its head bent forward, as if listening. Holmes stared at it for a long time. "It is not a trick of the exposure," he said finally. "The shape exists on the negative. There is no question." I felt a chill pass through me. "You think Gregory saw this?" "Perhaps not with his eyes," Holmes murmured. "But he knew it was there. That is why he built the device. To communicate." He reached for the third photograph. It was the smallest and the clearest. This one depicted the mirror alone, but within its shattered face, caught in silver fracture lines, was a reflection, not of the chamber, not of the camera, of a man, thin, pale, eyes wild, staring directly into the lens. "Gregory," I whispered. Holmes nodded, slow and grim. "Or something wearing his face." We spent the next day studying Gregory's remaining journals. They were dense, scrawled with equations, dream sequences, and fevered musings. One passage, carefully written in red ink, stood out. "The eye is not a watcher. It is a mirror itself. It shows the shape of thought, not body. The deeper the mirror, the less it reflects the real. Instead, it begins to reflect the true. Holmes tapped the line. He believed he had found a pathway to perception divorced from matter. He called it the threshold because he imagined one could step through leave the limitations of sensory input and access pure cognition. I shook my head. But what did he actually create? A machine to destabilize perception, Holmes replied. Not through chemicals alone, but through resonance, optical stimulation, and psychological suggestion. The drugs were just a primer. The mirror, the way it was polished, the frequency of the hum it emitted, the angled reflections, all that was tuned. He closed the journal. Gregory weaponized belief. By midweek, Inspector Lestrade paid us a visit. He entered in a cloud of London damp, rubbing his gloves briskly. Afternoon, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. I've come from the asylum. Holmes rose. Gregory? Lestrade nodded. He's deteriorating. Was lucid for a day or two. Gave us statement bits about threshold echoes and sending messages backwards. Then he stopped speaking altogether. Hasn't said a word in 3 days. And the machine? Destroyed under government orders. The attic apparatus, the forgotten phonographs, the spray canisters burned and buried. Holmes stiffened. That was premature. Lestrade looked surprised. Premature? I thought you wanted it shut down. I wanted it secured, Holmes said sharply. We've learned how it worked, yes, but not why it worked. And not what it may have reached. Lestrade coughed uncomfortably. Well, I wouldn't worry too much, Mr. Holmes. Gregory's madder than a barrel of cats, and that house is sealed. Holmes's voice was very low. Madness does not nullify consequence. That evening, Holmes disappeared into his study with the photographs again. I left him alone for hours, until the fire had burned down and his lamp flickered under the dim haze of coal smoke dot. At last, I entered. He sat there, the third image, Gregory's reflection, pinned to the wall, with 2 brass tacks. Beside it, Holmes had drawn diagrams, overlays, mappings of face to skull, posture to frame. It was Holmesian precision at its most obsessive. He didn't look at me. Watson, he said, tell me truly. Do you believe the man in this photograph is Gregory? I approached, staring again at the ghostly figure in the mirror. It looks like him. The nose, the angle of the chin. But there's something off. The eyes. Holmes nodded. Yes, the eyes. I enlarged them. He handed me a magnifying lens. I leaned in. The eyes were wrong. Too large, too deep. And in the center of each pupil, barely perceptible, was another shape, not a reflection. Not a trick of film, a mirror, self-recursion, Holmes said. The image folding in on itself. I looked at him. What does it mean? He stood very slowly. I think Gregory succeeded. Not in building a communication device, but in building a loop. A chamber in which reflection becomes its own subject, where thought is mirrored back infinitely until it gains momentum. He stared at the photo. He didn't talk to another world. He created one. It was nearly dawn when we left the study, the mirror locked away in a lead-lined case beneath floorboards. Holmes had reinforced himself. The photographs were sealed and placed in the archives. Holmes made only one remark as he tightened the last bolt on the case. This is not for Scotland Yard, not for science. This is for silence. In the weeks that followed, life returned tentatively to normal. We took a simple theft case in Bermondsey, a missing bride in Marylebone, and a delightful fraudster with forged Rubens paintings in Chelsea dot. And yet Holmes remained altered. He no longer looked in mirrors. He removed the looking-glass from the hallway of Baker Street. The one in his bedroom vanished too. He shaved by touch alone. Why? I asked him once. His voice was very quiet. I'm no longer certain who's looking back. As spring came to London, I believed the case was finally laid to rest. Gregory Tunstall remained in institutional care, silent and distant, lost in that great fog of mirrors he had built for himself. Edwin and Violetta, I learned through correspondence, had sold Windermere Hall and moved abroad quietly, anonymously. Then, one morning in May, a parcel arrived. There was no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a mirror small, unadorned, standing on the floor of an empty room, and in its reflection, Holmes and me. Standing in Baker Street, Holmes holding the photograph I was. Now holding Dot, it was impossible, but it was real. I turned to Holmes, who stared at it in silence. After a long moment, he said simply, "They found another mirror." Chapter 9. The Whisper Through Glass. The morning light that filtered into 221B Baker Street felt curiously sterile the day the photograph arrived, clean, white, and cold. Not the kind that warms the soul, but the kind that exposes what lies hidden in corners. Holmes stood with the photograph in his hand, unmoving, the image facing outward like a mirror in itself. We had received no note, no sender, no fingerprint, or traceable ink. Just a plain brown envelope hand-delivered according to Mrs. Hudson by a small boy in a green cap who vanished into the fog seconds after delivering it. "Watson," Holmes said at last, his voice edged with a metallic calm. "You saw this, did you not? This reflection us. But we were never present in such a room." "No," I replied, drawing nearer. "That mirror is unfamiliar. The room is bare. The walls are different. And yet it is our likeness, frozen in a moment we never experienced, from an angle we could not have seen." I leaned closer. "It's as if someone watched us from a place that didn't exist. A mirror that shows not what was, but what could have been." Holmes turned sharply on his heel. "Exactly. The logic of a mirror is to reflect. But this violates that principle. This image suggests independent observation, a watcher behind the glass, rather than a duplicate before it." I paused. Are we to believe Gregory had a confederate, someone who continued his work? Holmes paced to the desk, fetching a magnifying lens, and examined the photo's border. "That is the working hypothesis. But we must go further. If Gregory's delusions are contagious, if he left behind students, then we are not facing a lone visionary, but a network." He stopped abruptly, his voice low. "A cult of the mirror." Within hours, Holmes had our course plotted. The envelope itself, after close examination, yielded a single clue, a speck of blue wax sealed into the paper's inner fold. Holmes examined it under the microscope, then nodded to himself. Midnight blue. High-content lapis pigment, used only by 2 wax seal manufacturers in London, one in Soho, the other in Clerkenwell. But only one sells to private clubs. Holmes and I rode at once by hansom to Little Drury Lane, where the address in question led us to a discreet storefront. Pendleton's Waxes and Embellishments. Holmes presented a fabricated letter of inquiry under the name of Lord Hatherley, a persona he'd perfected some years ago, and gained the sheer attention of the proprietor. Within minutes, we had a match. Yes, the clerk said, tapping the records. This exact blend was ordered in a dozen sticks. Only one private client uses it regularly. A certain glass society meeting at No. 6 Gallimere Row, Whitechapel. Holmes's face did not change, but I felt the temperature in the room drop perceptibly. Glass society? I asked, under my breath. The clerk shrugged. Odd sort, quiet, always orders through a courier. We never see them. Holmes turned to me. Watson, prepare yourself. We shall be calling on them tonight. No, 6 Gallimere Row was not a house at all, but a converted warehouse, a tall, dark structure set between two burnt-out textile mills, its windows papered over, its door fitted with a peculiar brass knocker, shaped like an eye. We waited until twilight. Holmes changed attire, donning a charcoal overcoat, rimless spectacles, and a walking cane tipped in silver. I dressed as a simple tradesman, carrying a leather satchel filled with old ledgers to complete the image. At precisely 7:15, Holmes knocked 3 times. A slit opened. A voice behind it whispered, through reflection, truth. Holmes answered, without pause, beyond perception, light. The door opened. We stepped into a hallway lined in deep burgundy. It smelled faintly of incense and old books. A man in a dark robe ushered us forward. You are new, initiates? Holmes inclined his head. We come bearing observation. The man said nothing further, but led us down a narrow stairwell, into a lower room lit only by candlelight. There were 7 individuals seated in a half-circle, around a small black mirror. No faces were clearly visible, only the glow of their candle lit. Profiles in the dull gleam of the mirror's obsidian surface. The man gestured for us to sit. Holmes did. I followed, uncertain. Then a woman spoke. Her voice was low, smooth, and deliberate. What did you see, brothers? Another voice answered. A message arrived, the image of the watchers. They saw us, though they were unseen. A murmur of agreement. They come, said another voice. He warned us. He said their names. Holmes, whispered a third. Watson, the ones who follow reflections. Holmes said nothing. Then the woman turned toward him, eyes glinting. You wear false skin, she said, but your eyes betray you. Holmes removed the spectacles. I am here, he said evenly, to know. A silence. Then the woman nodded. We follow the teachings of the threshold, the mirror that does not reflect but recalls. Gregory Tunstall was our harbinger, not our master. We were before him. We are after. Holmes folded his hands. What do you seek? Continuity, she replied. Through memory unshackled from time. Through thought preserved beyond body. Gregory broke the skin of the world, but we passed through it. You sent the photograph. Yes, why? To warn you and to offer a choice. Holmes's eyes narrowed. What choice? To join us or to be consumed? At that, 2 of the seated figures stood. One held a lantern. The other held a cloth. The woman gestured to the mirror. It shimmered. And for a moment, I saw myself older, bloodied, alone in a version of Baker Street, cloaked in fog. Holmes saw it too. His reflection did not move as he did. It simply stared. Back then slowly raised a finger to its lips. Silence. Then darkness. When we emerged, it was nearly midnight. No one followed. The warehouse door was sealed behind us. No lights burned. Holmes said nothing for several blocks until we crossed into more familiar streets near Covent Garden. Then, at last, he spoke. "They are not madmen, Watson." "No?" "No, they are explorers." "And what did they show?" "You?" Holmes glanced up at the moonlight glinting off a puddle in the road. "They showed us possibility." Back at Baker Street, Holmes burned the photograph. "I will not become a symbol," he said softly. "I solve puzzles. I do not become them." But he did not sleep that night. And the next morning I found that he had purchased a new mirror. Small. Round. Polished. Obsidian. He placed it on the mantel without a word, and from then on he never looked directly at it. Chapter 10. The depths that watched back. It was a rain-drenched morning in late April when Holmes asked me to accompany him to the vaults beneath the Royal Society. He had spoken little since our encounter with the so-called Glass Society. He passed his hours in study, in silence, and long walks through the fog-choked lanes near the Thames. At Baker Street, the black mirror on our mantel remained untouched, yet it dominated the room like a sleeping predator. I had grown concerned. Holmes was no stranger to obsession, but this was different, a quiet, restrained intensity, like a candle burning down in a closed room. So when he told me, "We must go to the vaults," I agreed at once. I did not ask why. I only gathered my coat and followed him into the rain. The vaults were buried deep beneath the Society's marble facade. Normally used for storing rare manuscripts and discredited inventions, the underground chambers were lined with wrought iron shelves and ancient stone archways. Holmes had secured a private viewing room under the guise of researching optical illusions and pre-Roman artifacts, a flimsy pretense, but one no clerk dared question. We were alone in the final chamber. A single gaslight burned on the wall. Holmes placed his satchel on the table and, with great care, retrieved the obsidian mirror. The same one from our mantel. It was round, no larger than a dinner plate, and polished to a dark, lustrous black. Its surface reflected no light only. Swallowed it. Holmes set it down before him. Then he turned to me. "Watson, I need you to take down everything that follows. Every word, every detail. No interpretation, no hesitation." I opened my notebook. He lit a small lantern, then sat directly across from the mirror. "I am Sherlock Holmes," he said aloud, speaking not to me, but to the glass. "I do not seek to cross the threshold. I seek to know who built it." The mirror remained still. Then Holmes reached into his pocket and withdrew something I had not seen in years, a small silver coin, given to him long ago by a spiritualist we had once debunked in Edinburgh. It bore an engraving of an eye within a triangle. He placed it before the mirror, and then he waited. At first, nothing changed. The mirror reflected darkness. Its surface remained calm, inert. But then, just as I was about to speak, I saw a flicker. A tremor, a ripple across the glass like a breath fogging a window. And then a face. Not Holmes's, not mine. A woman, pale, unfamiliar, eyes wide and black as coal. She hovered at the edge of the mirror, as if behind it. She did not blink. She only watched. Holmes did not flinch. "Who are you?" he asked. No reply. Do you want? Still silence. Then the woman's mouth moved. Holmes leaned closer. I strained to hear, but no sound emerged. Still, Holmes nodded. He spoke again. Gregory was your conduit, but he failed. The woman's lips moved once more. Holmes stiffened slightly. His voice was lower now. You do not seek dominion. You seek remembrance. A pause. Then Holmes whispered, You are not a being. You are a thought. A memory, recursive. The woman blinked, and vanished. The mirror turned black again. Holmes exhaled slowly, as though emerging from deep water. We did not speak for some time. I had written every word, every pause, every detail. Holmes remained motionless, staring at the empty mirror, as if hoping it would speak again. At last, I broke the silence. What did she say? He looked at me, his face unreadable, not in words, in concepts. Then what did you understand? Holmes rose, pocketing the silver coin again. That the mirror is not a window to another world, but a memory of one. He walked slowly to the edge of the chamber. The consciousness behind the glass is not alive in the way we understand. It is residue, echoes of a civilization, perhaps, or a mind long gone. Gregory was correct. He merely mistook direction for intent. I stepped forward. And the Glass Society? They follow a memory? They worship it, Holmes said coldly. But memory is not truth. It is reconstruction. He turned back to me. Gregory believed he was uncovering a gateway. In truth, he was building a projector. The mirror does not reflect reality. It reflects what once thought it was real. A chill ran down my spine. Then what did we see? Gregory's face in the photograph? My own death? The woman? Possibilities, Holmes replied. False futures. Cast-offs from a dreamer who has long since ceased to dream. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes removed the mirror from the mantel for the last time. He wrapped it in black velvet, placed it in a wooden box lined with lead and cedar, and sealed it with wax. He handed it to me. Take this to Mycroft. Tell him to place it where it can neither be worshipped nor studied. It must rest permanently. I nodded. Then I hesitated. And the Glass Society? Holmes looked toward the dark window. They will fade. Without the mirror, they have no echo to follow. They will listen and hear nothing. And Gregory? Holmes's gaze did not shift. He became the mirror. But even reflections forget themselves in time. A week later, I returned to find Holmes seated in the armchair, violin across his knee, but unplayed. You are quiet, I said, setting my coat aside. I have seen quiet, he murmured. This is recovery. I smiled faintly. A case without. A corpse, without a crime. And yet I feel we buried something. Holmes gave a thin smile. We buried a question, the most dangerous kind. What if thought could outlive the thinker? I poured us both tea. You still do not look in mirrors. Holmes shook his head. Not for now. He raised his cup. But I do enjoy seeing myself in your eyes, Watson. There, at least, I know I exist. And so the case of the mirror that lied came to its close, not with a trial or a villain in cuffs, but with silence. The box was never found again. The Glass Society vanished from their Whitechapel lair. Gregory's mind slipped into permanent dormancy. But even now, when I close my eyes, I sometimes see her watching from behind the glass, as if remembering me better than I remember myself. And I wonder, when we gaze too long into the mirror, does it begin to remember us? Or are we merely becoming the next reflection? Chapter 11. The image that would not vanish, I had believed it ended. The mirror had been sealed, the glass society dispersed, and Gregory Tunstall had vanished into the folds of forgotten institutions. Holmes returned to cases of a more earthly kind, embezzlers, missing wills, lovers' deceptions. The tempo of our lives slowed, as if we had both stepped out of a fevered dream. But dreams do not always end. Some lie dormant, waiting for a name to be spoken, and that name came back to us on a summer morning, like any other, wrapped and crinkled, newsprint and bearing a London postmark with no return address. I was in the breakfast room, sorting through correspondence when I found it. A small packet, unremarkable save for the faint smell of lavender and something more burnt oil. Perhaps. Holmes glanced up from his untouched toast. More invitations to dull dinners, I presume? I shook my head. No return, no seal. Just your name on the front, not even the usual ink look. He examined it briefly, graphite rubbed with a soft cloth, to avoid smudging. Curious. I opened the wrapping carefully. Inside was a photograph, not another one. Holmes stiffened, even before I fully revealed it. It was us again, Holmes, and I, seated in Baker Street, but older. I bore a cane. Holmes's hair was streaked with silver, and on the table between us sat ... the obsidian mirror. The same one he had locked away. The image was sharp. Too sharp. Holmes, I whispered, this cannot exist. It shows us years from now. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, so it never ended. That evening, Holmes retrieved the journal he had kept during the investigation of Gregory Tunstall, the one he had locked away after Chapter 10, along with a mirror. But the mirror was gone. The velvet-lined case, hidden beneath the floorboards, was still sealed, untouched, undisturbed. But it was empty. Holmes's hands trembled ever so slightly as he inspected the box. No signs of forced entry. The wax seal remains intact. The cedar has not warped. He looked up at me. This box was never opened. But ... the mirror? He was already moving, storming to the bookshelves and pulling down volumes, cross-referencing diagrams and notes I hadn't seen in months. Watson listened carefully. What Gregory awakened may not have been a mere illusion or hallucination. It was a loop, a cycle, and we may still be within its influence. I stared at the photo again. The details, the lighting, the frame of the window, even the arrangement of books on the shelf were exact. Except for one thing. There's something else, I said, pointing behind Holmes's image in the photo. Just at the edge of the frame stood a dark silhouette, humanoid, featureless, as if someone had entered the room unnoticed. Holmes saw it, his jaw clenched. We're being observed. The next day, Holmes did something I had never seen him do in all our years together. He wrote to Mycroft for help. The reply came swiftly. Mycroft's agents had secured the original mirror, placed it in a lead-lined vault within the British Museum's restricted wing, and had not touched it since. The seal on the vault remained unbroken. The mirror, he insisted, had not been removed. Holmes's reply was succinct. Then we are dealing with a copy, a recursive twin. We returned that afternoon to the vault to confirm, and the mirror was there, perfectly still. Undisturbed, Holmes studied it with a gloved hand. his reflection never once. Meeting his eyes, "It is still here," he murmured, "yet its image has escaped." Back at Baker Street, we reviewed the new photograph under every analysis. Light exposure, chemical composition, shadow parallax. Everything matched. The photo was real, not forged, and yet impossible. "Then it must be future," I said, "or a fiction posing as one." Holmes tapped the photograph again. "No, Watson. It's an echo, a resonance." The mirror did not simply reflect light, it remembered, and it imprinted. What we are seeing now is not prophecy, but repetition. He turned to me, his voice suddenly colder. "Do you recall the phrase from the Glass Society? Through reflection, truth, beyond perception, light." I nodded. They believed that seeing one's own image through the mirror connected one not to the present, but to an echo of intent, a version of oneself preserved not in glass, but in thought. And now, someone or something is reconstructing those thoughts. I swallowed. "Then what are we seeing in these photographs?" He looked up at me, solemn. "Ghosts of ourselves, not spectral, not supernatural, but conceptual." I could not help the shudder that passed through me. 3 days later, Mrs. Hudson screamed. We rushed to the staircase to find her frozen at the foot of the landing, trembling. "There was a man," she gasped, "standing in the hall mirror, but when I turned, there was no one there, only my own face." Holmes hurried past her and inspected the mirror. Nothing, only us, our ordinary reflections. He leaned in closer. "Watson, the angle stand there." I obeyed Dot. Then he took a sheet of thin black paper and overlaid it on the mirror, carefully tracing where Mrs. Hudson claimed to have seen the figure. When he finished, he peeled it off and revealed the outline. Dot same as in the photograph. Dot same. Posture. Dot same silhouette. "We are being fed memories," Holmes said. "Artificially. It's not the mirror that watches, it's the idea of the mirror, and that idea has escaped its boundaries." He turned slowly, eyes fixed on some middle distance. "We must go back." I knew immediately what he meant. Windmere. Hall. The original epicenter. Dot. We left the next morning. The manor had long been shuttered, but Holmes had kept a set of keys, retrieved from Lestrade after the case had been closed. The grounds were overgrown. The ivy had begun reclaiming the east wing, but the skeleton of Gregory's empire remained intact. We descended into the oubliette once more. Nothing had changed except the silence. It was heavier now, thicker. Holmes returned to the hatch beneath the pedestal. It, too, was sealed. But when we opened it, the chamber was gone. In its place was a staircase, descending deeper. Holmes looked at me, eyes hard. They built again. The steps wound down for what felt like hours. The air grew colder. The darkness became absolute. And then we emerged into a room of polished glass. Every wall, every surface, mirrors countless, seamless, reflecting every angle of ourselves. 100 times over. Holmes stepped forward. In each mirror, his image moved. Except for one dot in that panel, he remained still. I watched him freeze. "There," he said. "Gregory?" "No." He pointed. It was the silhouette. This time. It raised its hand, palm outward. 5 fingers, then it moved its hand in a slow circle, around and around. Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. "It's not asking us to see ourselves." He stepped forward, It's asking us to choose which one we are. And suddenly, the light dawned. Chapter 12. The reflection that remembered the darkness was not mere absence, it was presence. A thick, cloying force that settled into the lungs and draped itself across our shoulders like a funeral shroud. The mirrored chamber beneath Windmere Hall pulsed with a strange, silent life, as though the walls themselves inhaled and exhaled in rhythm with our heartbeats. My footsteps echoed with unnatural clarity. Every motion created a cascade of ghostly echoes across the hundreds of polished glass panels surrounding us. We stood inside a hall of mirrors, but none like those of carnival or folly. These were not meant to amuse. They were meant to preserve. Holmes stood motionless at the center, framed by a ring of light that seemed to come from no source at all. Before him, one mirror stood out, subtly, eerily. In every other panel, we moved in tandem with our reflections. But in this one, Holmes's image stood perfectly still, the silhouette, a human outline but flat, dimensionless, as if rendered in ink. Its face was a blank oval, its limbs long and too symmetrical. It raised one hand, palm facing us. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice low and unwavering. "Tell me what you see." I squinted, my nerves tight as wire. "I see you in dozens of mirrors, but that one," I pointed, "it doesn't copy you, it's separate, like a figure waiting behind the glass." "And yourself?" he asked. I turned and felt the bottom drop from my stomach. In the mirror just over Holmes's left shoulder, my own reflection was a breath out of step. It lagged subtly but unmistakably, and its eyes were not mine. "Holmes," I whispered, "I think it's doing the same to me." Holmes gave a single, deliberate nod. Then the mirror no longer reflects, it selects. We are not observing it. We are being measured by it. He stepped forward, and in that moment, the unmoving figure in the glass did the same. It lowered its hand. Then, slowly, it opened its mouth. No sound emerged. Only light. It was not bright, not harsh, but rather a flat, gray luminescence that spilled from the mirror like fog from a crypt. It illuminated nothing, and yet touched everything, bleeding into the mirrored walls, which began to shimmer like water, disturbed. And then the images within the glass began to shift. In one panel, I saw myself younger, clutching a bloodied field journal in Afghanistan, dying beneath the desert sun. In another, Holmes was confined in a cold cell, his fingers bloodied, his violin broken at his feet. In yet another, 221 B. Baker Street was reversed. The chairs sat where the windows should be, Holmes and I seated across from one another, but each bearing scars and hollow eyes. Each pane presented a different version of us, some subtle, some grotesque, all wrong. Holmes raised a hand and turned, slowly taking in the multitude of selves. "They are not illusions," he said at last. "They are memories, versions of what might have been, preserved not by time, but by intention." He turned to me. "This chamber is not just a mirror, Watson. It is a conscious archive, a place where decisions echo." I felt my throat dry. "But why show them to us?" "Because Gregory's invention was never a gateway. It was a recorder. It captured thought, and once thought was captured, it became structure. Now those structures seek pattern. They seek continuity." The figure in the mirror stepped forward again, still inside the glass, but closer now. The distinction between Reflection and reality blurred. Holmes did not retreat. "If it crosses that threshold," he murmured, "you must act." I turned. "With what?" Holmes drew from his coat a flask wrapped in thick oilcloth. He handed it to me, mercury nitrate. I remembered its preparation from earlier in the case, but now I realized its purpose was not forensic. It will blind. "The glass," Holmes said. "Shatter it first. Then pour this along the cracks. It will corrode the layer behind the reflection. And if you don't return—" He paused, his hand briefly on my shoulder. A rare, silent gesture of trust. Then, "Do not let it remember me." He stepped forward, and walked into the glass. But he did not disappear. Instead, the mirror shimmered and absorbed him. Not physically, but conceptually. His image merged with the silhouette like oil, with ink distinct, yet inseparable. Within the glass, I saw him, Holmes, surrounded by endless replications of himself, each slightly different. One laughed hysterically. One wept, whispering to unseen companions. Another stared directly at me, his eyes like twin coals. The Holmes I knew closed his eyes, and the mirrors began to shake. Then came the voice. "We do not lie. We reflect what you bring." Not a voice in air, but inside the mind, calm, ancient, simultaneously singular and plural. "You brought memory. You brought will. We became you, and you became us." I stumbled back, heart racing. Holmes. His eyes opened. They were dark, starless, but he was still himself. "Watson," he said with finality. "Now." I hesitated, but only for a moment. With a cry, I hurled the flask at the base of the central mirror. Glass shattered. The explosion of sound was unnatural-like. Crystal and steel being torn apart by thunder. Shards flew in all directions, refracting the light into a kaleidoscope of impossible geometries. I poured the mercury nitrate into the cracks. The fluid hissed, seeping into the back of the mirror. The obsidian began to boil its dark surface, bubbling and warping, as if rejecting the intrusion. And then screams. Not audible screams, but a psychic vacuum, as though hundreds of possible selves were being extinguished simultaneously. Then blackness. I awoke in silence. The mirror chamber was gone. The air was still. Cold. Only dust remained, and fragments of shattered glass strewn across the stone floor like fallen stars. "Holmes?" I whispered, staggering to my feet. No reply. I called again. Only echoes returned. The mirrors were lifeless. Now their light was extinguished. I stumbled out, half-blinded, clawing my way back up the endless spiral stairs. By the time I emerged into the shattered husk of Windermere Hall, the sun had broken the clouds. The ivy clung to the stone walls. The air was clean, but Sherlock Holmes was not there. I do not recall the journey home, only that Baker Street was silent when I returned. His chair remained by the fire. His violin stood in its corner. The table bore his latest monograph on beetle wing iridescence, finished. But the mirror, the one that began it all, was gone. Weeks passed. Then months. Life resumed, as it must. Scotland Yard came and went. Lestrade made polite inquiries. I lied to him gently. I told no one about the chamber. Then, one gray October morning, a package arrived. No note, no sender, wrapped in coarse cloth. Opened it slowly. Inside, a violin. Not new. Worn, the strings slightly warped by time and use. but unmistakably Holmes's, and tucked beneath the bridge, a folded slip of paper dot in his hand. Reflections are only dangerous when we forget who casts them. I remember S.H. So he lives, not lost, not trapped, but preserved, somewhere within the folds of thought, beneath the layers of memory, in the dim vault of what Gregory Tunstall once called truth. Holmes remains, not as a ghost, not as a reflection, but as intention, dot, and perhaps, when the mind quiets and the mirror grows still, if one listens closely, he will answer. Chapter 13. Echoes beyond the glass. It had been 4 months since the mirror shattered beneath Windermere Hall. 4 months since Sherlock Holmes vanished into the glass and left me behind, clutching a flask of mercury nitrate and a heart too heavy for words. London, ever indifferent, carried on. Horse carts rattled across wet cobbles. The clamor of markets rose each morning with mechanical persistence. The bells of St. Dunstan's tolled with stately indifference. But to me the world had lost its sharpness, its vitality, as though I walked through a faded photograph rather than the city I had known with Holmes at my side. Winter had arrived in fits and starts. The wind grew sharper, the fog thicker, but it wasn't the cold that unsettled me. It was the hollow 221B Baker Street remained intact, nearly unchanged. His coat still hung by the door. His shelves bore the same orderly clutter, pipettes, arcane, texts, half-finished monographs. Yet the air was too still, as if the room itself held its breath. I found myself pausing in the doorway of his study, half expecting to hear the familiar rasp of his violin or the sudden brilliance of a deduction. Dropped like a match in the dark. Mrs. Hudson said little, but once, when delivering tea, she set the tray down more softly than usual, her eyes lingering on Holmes's vacant chair. "He'll be back," she said quietly, then fled before I could reply. I did not tell her what I truly believed not, because I had given up hope, but because I no longer trusted my own understanding of hope. Holmes had not died. Of that I was certain. What had happened to him lay beyond that binary distinction of life and death. He had become something else, an observer within the framework he had once sought to decode. And so I waited. One gray morning, stirred by a restlessness I could not explain, I took the train back to Sussex. The journey was uneventful, though. The skies grew darker the closer I came to Windermere Hall. It was a kind of darkness that didn't descend so much as seep into the landscape, clinging to hedgerows and puddles like ink diluted through cloth. The estate, now wholly abandoned, had been claimed by silence and vines. The gate stood ajar, rusted and leaning at a tired angle. I passed through it as one might cross into a dream. One has tried to forget. The mansion's frame loomed like a skeleton of its former grandeur-arched windows shattered, ivy consuming the lintels. Inside, the air smelled of damp stone and secrets. Dust motes hung like phantoms in the dim light. I walked slowly, tracing the path we had taken during our final descent. The marble corridor remained, though time had cracked the tiles and peeled away the last remnants of paint. Tunstall's laboratory had collapsed in places, his once prized instruments left to rust and rot. And yet, beneath the disarray, I felt it. A pressure, a sensation not of being watched, but remembered. The staircase that had once spiraled down into the mirrored chamber was no longer there. Only a hollow remained, now filled with rubble and soil. But standing at the edge of the yawning pit, I felt a faint pull like gravity, but stranger, emotional, intellectual. He had passed this way, and part of him lingered still. I knelt and touched the earth. It was cold, but not lifeless. I closed my eyes, willing myself to feel anything. An echo, a resonance, a final note, but there was only silence. Still, I whispered into the darkness, "Holmes, if you're there." A breath of wind swept through the broken hall, rattling shards of glass and stirring the brittle ivy overhead. No voice answered. I had not expected one. The return to Baker Street was quiet. The city moved around me like a dream. I walked its streets as though I were following the ghost of my own footsteps. That evening, I sat alone by the hearth, a brandy in one hand, the violin in its case beside me. I had not touched it since its arrival. Holmes's old violin, worn by time and travel, sent without a return address, wrapped in coarse cloth, as though passed from one hand to another across impossible distances. There had been a note, too. Reflections are only dangerous when we forget who cast them. I remember S.H. And now, as the fire crackled low and the mirror above the mantel caught its shifting light, I felt a growing pressure behind my ribs. Not grief, not fear, anticipation. I opened the case. The violin was old, but not neglected. The wood had darkened. The strings slightly warped, but the instrument seemed to hum with a private knowledge, as though it remembered music I could not. I lifted it awkwardly. I had never learned to play. Holmes had once tried to teach me briefly, but I lacked the discipline. Yet tonight I placed it beneath my chin, raised the bow, and drew a single note. Trembled. Off key. Thin, but it carried. I drew a second, then a third, and then I stopped. The mirror above the fireplace had changed. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. The fire danced low, and my shadow flickered softly in the glass. But then the surface shivered. It rippled, not visibly, but perceptibly, as if the glass no longer simply reflected, but received. I stepped closer. There I was, shoulders drawn, eyes tired, but behind me, something else. Just beyond the reflection of my own image stood a shadow, a familiar one, the faint edge of a long coat, the glint of a violin beneath an arm, a figure partially obscured out of focus, as if remembered through mist. I reached out, my fingers nearly brushing the glass. Nothing. Cool to the touch. But as I leaned in, my breath fogged the mirror's edge. I blinked. And then a voice. So soft I might have imagined it. But it was unmistakable. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. I staggered back. The voice was gone. The image, too. Only myself remained in the mirror. Yet I was not frightened, nor sorrowful. I was anchored. It had not been contact in the physical sense, but it was real. Holmes had spoken, or something of him had. Not a ghost, not an echo, a thought, preserved and projected. A thread between minds that once had worked in tandem. He was not lost, not dead, not even absent, merely resonant. In the days that followed, I found a strange peace. I returned to St. Bartholomew's. I resumed my writing. I even lectured once again on battlefield trauma, though part of me now understood trauma of another kind, one not born of blood and shrapnel, but of perception and reflection. At night, I would often sit by the fire, I did not always play the violin, but I always listened, and occasionally on the coldest nights, when the wind drew patterns upon the windows and the city held its breath, I would hear a faint note soft and distant coming, not from the air, but from within, not from the strings, but from memory, and so I wait, not for his return, no. I believe Holmes exists now in a realm not ruled by clocks or carriages. He has stepped beyond deduction, beyond form. He lives not as a man of flesh and bone, but as something more refined, an intention, a will that persists wherever truth is sought. And perhaps one day, when some new mystery presses too close to the soul of the world, when danger demands not just logic but clarity, the mirror will shimmer once more, the bow will draw across the strings, and Sherlock Holmes will answer. Chapter 14. The Mind Behind the Mirror. It was on the 12th evening of February that the mirror shimmered once more. There had been no summons, no wind, no trembling in the glass. The fire crackled gently, and I had just returned from an evening lecture at the Royal College of Surgeons. But as I entered 221B Baker Street, coat still damp from a passing drizzle, I paused, the violin case, sat closed beside the hearth. The chair across from mine, Holmes's chair, was still empty, but the air had changed, and the mirror watched me, not literally. No face emerged, no ghostly silhouette pressed forward, but in its stillness I felt presence. Not passive reflection, but intention. Waiting, I stood before it for several minutes. Then, without knowing why, I fetched. The violin, this time. I did not draw the bow with awkwardness. My hand moved steadily, confidently, as though guided by memory not fully my own. The tone was soft, fragile, but the moment it sang, the mirror flickered, once, then, impossibly. A voice filled the room, not aloud, not in the ears, but in the mind. I have seen beyond the glass, Watson. My heart caught, and what I have seen confirms what I have long suspected. That truth is not found in facts alone, but in choice, in which reflection one accepts as real. Holmes? I whispered. The mirror rippled. In its surface I saw him not as shadow, not as flicker, but as himself, standing, coat buttoned high, face contemplative. His brow furrowed, not in confusion, but concentration. He continued. Gregory Tunstall did not build a window to the soul. He built a hall of choice, each reflection a potential, each path a consequence. The mirror does not lie, it remembers. But, he added, memory is not truth, and therein lies the danger. I sank into the chair opposite his image. Then how did you return? I asked. How is this possible? Holmes's expression did not change, but I sensed the faintest glint of approval. I did not return. Watson, I chose. Within the mirror I saw thousands of selves. I watched lives where we never met, cases I never solved, victories I never claimed. But I remembered you. I remembered Baker Street. I remembered the version of myself not merely clever, but anchored by reason, grounded by friendship. He paused. In choosing that self, I weakened the recursion. It fed upon uncertainty, but I gave it resolution. And so the glass fractured. And now I remain here, not wholly of your world, not wholly absent. But when you play the violin, when you recall, you invite coherence. You pull me from the current of infinite, selves. I swallowed hard. Then, you are a memory? No, he said. A choice. One made again and again, each time you believe I am still with you. The mirror dimmed. The image faded, but not with finality, with rest, with closure. Later that evening, I sorted through Holmes's papers, not for evidence nor for meaning, but for a quiet kind of remembrance. In one folder, I found something new, an envelope labeled only, should logic fail. Inside, a final letter. My dear Watson, if you're reading this, then the mirror has done what no mortal adversary could, delay my return. But know this reflection is never passive. It is a crucible. In it, a man must see all versions of himself and decide who he will become. You were my anchor, Watson. Where I wandered, you stood firm. Where I theorized, you believed. Do not let the mirror consume you, as it nearly did me. Truth is not a perfect deduction. It is a constant reckoning. Until next we meet, perhaps in sound and dream, or in the quiet click of a London lock, yours ever, Sherlock Holmes. And so the case concluded, not with a trial, nor with the arrest of some wretched villain, but with a truth stranger and more haunting than any Holmes had ever encountered. Gregory Tunstall's mirror had not been a window to the supernatural, nor a doorway to the dead. It was something far more dangerous, a place where the mind could see itself from every angle and forget which angle was real. Holmes had walked that labyrinth of reflection, stared into the faces of his own potential, and chosen not brilliance, not perfection, but continuity, the version of himself tethered by logic, by habit, by friendship. By me. In the months that followed, I did not speak of the mirror again. Not to the Yard, not to the Royal Society, not even to Mrs. Hudson. The mirror itself remained at 221B, dull and quiet. Sometimes it was simply a mirror. Sometimes on a rain-soaked afternoon or a candlelit evening, it trembled slightly in its frame, and every so often I would draw the bow again, not to summon Holmes, but to remember him, because in the end, that is what the mirror demanded, not obedience nor awe, but memory. And Holmes, the man who had once solved the most intricate of human puzzles, had found his final answer not in deduction, but in remembrance. Fin is, the mirror does not lie. It remembers.